to honor Loring Sabin Ensign, who is here with us today, Master of Divinity in 1951, for his 25 years of service at Southport Congregational Church. The general theme of the endowed lectureship is contemporary interpretation of religious issues. Previous Ensign lecturers have included William May, Amba Oduyoye, Sister Helen Prejean, Jean Elstein, and Marie Fortune, to name a few. Today's lecturer is Professor Don Cupitt, former Dean of Emmanuel College and the Department of History and Philosophy of Science at the University of Cambridge. His lecture will be entitled, A New Method of Religious Inquiry. Professor Cupitt is best known as a teacher and writer in the area of philosophy of religion. Most of his 23 titles reflect the development of his thinking, from taking leave of God to emptiness and brightness. In addition to his many books, he's also made 3 television series, of which The Sea of Faith was in turn made into a book. Professor Cupitt was ordained in the Church of England in 1959 and served as vice principal of Westcott House, an Anglican theological college in Cambridge from 1962 to 1965. Professor Cupitt believes that people are constrained by some of the values and religious perspectives that are already coded into our ordinary language. True religion, he says, is already there, and we already believe it. It only needs to be brought out into the open. When we see it clearly for the first time, it is a big surprise. I hope tonight we'll be hearing some of the big surprise. I'm delighted to have Professor Cupitt with us and look forward to your lecture.
Thank you very much, and I'm sorry to have brought you out on such a bad evening. When I was first asked to undertake this engagement, I was a bit surprised. I wondered, is there perhaps someone here who's thrilled by the thought that my college at Cambridge produced John Harvard? No, perhaps not that. Have I a reputation as a creative theologian? And I didn't think it could be that either, because in Britain, and probably also in here, a creative theologian has about the same sort of reputation as a creative accountant. If you say creative accountant in Britain, people hear fraud, and if you say creative theologian, people hear heretic. But one of the objects of this lecture, the contemporary interpretation of religious issues, is very close to my own heart. And it reminds me of a particular interest of my own in the last 5 or 6 years, which is an attempt to democratize religious thought. Traditionally, in the Western tradition, we've all followed Plato. We've seen everything as pre-existing in the heavenly world and as coming down ready-made to us via, of course, an elite of interpreters and keepers. In our thinking, we seem, most of us, still to be absolute monarchists. We might be Democrats in politics, but in religion we remain absolute monarchists. We still think of truth as being given to us on a plate, ready-made, needing only to be believed. We've not yet democratized religious thought in the way that we've modernized thinking about other subjects, such as, say, language. In the modern period, we have increasingly come to see everything as coming up from below, as generated out of everyday human interactions. Just bumpings into each other of human beings turn gradually into conventions, they turn into rules, and they eventually become laws. This is true of language, of meanings and truths and values, of the whole of knowledge and culture. It's difficult to think through consistently the idea that human beings themselves have evolved language and everything that language does just from within their own bumpings into each other day by day. But it's unavoidable. But can the same thought be carried through in the area of religion? Can we learn to see human beings as though having themselves generated the religion that is sacred to them and that they live by? Can you believe your myths in the knowledge that they're myths? Can you believe and practice your religion? Can it be sacred to you if you fully understand that we human beings made it all up? Well, in the case of the law, we do know that we made the law. But it can still be the case that although the law is, as it were, a human improvisation which we are continually modifying, nevertheless, something of the language of the sacred does get transferred to the law and to human rights. Human rights are not natural facts, they're human historical inventions, yet we still use religious language in connection with them. So religion itself, if we've understood that all ideas about the sacred, the holy, are human inventions, can they still mean the same to us? It's an interesting question. Well, perhaps this very thought seems at first very paradoxical, not to say alarmingly heretical. But since the 18th century, empirical study of religious origins and history has gradually made it harder and harder to deny that we humans made it all up. It's all a human historical product, just like the rest of culture. We've been using a fundamentally secular and naturalistic historical method to write church history, to study the Bible and the history of Christian doctrine for well over 200 years, going back to the German universities in the Enlightenment. So eventually, the conviction is bound to impress itself upon us that a religion is like a cultural tradition that human beings have evolved. It's a bit like folk art, a tradition of folk art. Hence my term expressionism, which I've used for the turn of in my thinking that took place about 1990, moving over to an expressionist conception of religion. Religion is a human symbolic expression through which we try to relate ourselves to the fundamental conditions of our own existence. The different ways we do that over time are the evolution of our religious tradition. Well, it's a very different way of thinking about religion from traditionalist and authoritarian ways such as we've inherited from the past. And it takes some working through this new perspective. I've used various expressions in the books of recent years for the new kind of approach to religious thought that I'm trying to advocate. I've called it democratic theology. I've called it ordinary language theology, because what I actually study is idioms in everyday speech that are known to everybody. Kingdom theology, because I see it as the way we'll think about religion in the post-ecclesiastical period, which I see as having already begun. And sometimes they call it the new religion of life, because it's a period in which we have transferred just to life many of the attributes of God, and to our own lives many of the qualities of what we used to call our souls. My own life into an object today that my soul was in the past. The new religion of life is a religion in which the religious object has become just life itself, to which we relate ourselves immediately. It is life, the living of life, that is the sacred task. By the way, these thoughts spread simultaneously. After my first book on the new religion of life appeared, within a year, I learned just lately, a book on the same topic appeared in Germany, and I was able to get a copy and show the curious way in which different people in different countries can have the same thoughts at the same time. What about the new method? Now then, if a new approach to religious thought is now beginning to open up, What about the method to be used? I've got a little handout, and there are enough people, I think, to distribute the copies for the next 10 minutes or so. Introducing the idea of a new method, an objectively empirical method of religious inquiry. It's a simple handout. And it follows the outline of this lecture, which I sent in advance. At the end of the 18th century, traditional Christian apologetics and theological method ran into crisis, perhaps broke down terminally, under the impact first of Kant's critical philosophy, which ended the old tradition of natural theology, the old tradition of dogmatic metaphysics, and the critical historical method, which ended the old method of proceeding simply by summing all your tradition together and deducing Christian dogma from it. The critical historical method applied to the Bible and the history of Christian doctrine produced a crisis which became clear, at least with D.F. Strauss's Life of Jesus Critically Examined of 1835-6, if not a generation earlier. Kant's critical philosophy led to the end of metaphysics very shortly afterwards, perhaps one might say, in Feuerbach and Karl Marx. Since that time, in the early 19th century, theology has lacked a generally agreed and publicly respected method that delivers and accumulates tested religious truth for today. Of course, the use of the critical historical method to study the Bible and the Christian tradition can teach you a lot of very interesting stuff about the different forms that religious thought takes in different historical periods, how its logic works and so on, but it doesn't itself actually produce any theological convictions. It's neutral, so far as personal faith is concerned. As a subject, theology has not made significant progress, and that, I think, is why the liberal and academic traditions in theology are today losing every time to conservative evangelicals in theological debate. In my own country, liberal academic theology is in a disastrous condition as a result of its failure to put up any sort of opposition to the evangelicals. It's because theology lacks a method that convincingly produces and accumulates religious truth, the sort of method that science has. Of course, there have been many attempts to propose such a method from William James onwards to create a science of religion that really would deliver an accumulation of religious truth. But these methods have all failed. These proposals have all failed. Attempts to develop a reliable theological method based on the study of religious experience have failed for results which I think for this country were well set out by Stephen Katz 20 years ago, as I think you'll know. And I believe the decline of religion today, the failure of the Christian tradition to develop in accordance with what was historically required, is precisely this point. We haven't got a theological method distinctively to theology that actually works. Well, the proposed new methods I'm trying to suggest extracts the philosophy, the system of values, the religious outlook that are already coded into the idioms of our everyday language. It aims to show what this common faith is, how far it constrains us, and how it is evolving. I came across it, I should say, about 6 years ago, at a time when I was getting ready to write The New Religion of Life in Everyday Speech. At that time, I was feeling that philosophy of religion was rather stuck, it needed a new method, and I began to try to find out what the ordinary person's thoughts about religion really are. I did it by the method of writing down stock phrases on a piece of paper. I got a pile of bits of paper and a pen and just began to scratch my head and wait for ideas to write. I started with things like, what is the meaning of life? Where will it all come to? Where will it all end? What am I? I started writing down dozens of just simple stock phrases from everyday English in which people ask about the point of it all. When I got about 6 or 8 pages of these, I sent them off to friends and asked for more. And when I got a good pile of phrases, I went through them with a highlighter pen, marking up the key words. And the 2 terms that occurred most frequently were life and it, especially in the combination, it all. What does it all mean? What's it all about? Things like that. Question put by a taxi driver once to Bertrand Russell. What does it all mean, said the taxi driver, and demanded a reply. What's it all about, he said, I think. Anyway, I started collecting life sayings, and when I got up to about 100 religiously interesting sayings about life that are current in everyday English, I went to the OED volume of about 1912, which contained the word life, and looked it up to see how many of them were in the OED. And of my first 100, only one was in the OED. Apparently, a massive growth of stock phrases about life has come into the English language during the 20th century. Now I began to feel I was making a discovery. I started looking for the literary sources of the new talk about life, and also for why it's been happening on such a scale in the modern period. Here are a couple of literary sources. You'll remember that in 1843, Henry David Thoreau moved into a hut by Walden Pond in order to wrestle with life. And wrestling with life is a stock phrase often heard in modern English. It is, of course, borrowed from the story of Jacob by the brook Jabbok wrestling with God. But whereas the ancient human being wrestled with God, today's human being goes into solitude to wrestle with life. Another example, 10 years after that, Leo Tolstoy was writing the last pages of War and Peace, and he describes Pierre's thoughts in captivity. Pierre thinks to himself, life is God, and to love life is to love God. Everything heaves and moves together in the human world, and that movement is God. Tolstoy, to an astounding degree, without ever having read Hegel, as far as I know, has brought his idea of God, his religious thought, down into the movement of history in which we're all caught up. So he demythologized God into existence, existence into contingent human existence, and he says to love life is to love God. Astoundingly original at the time that it was written, but the young Tolstoy was a great religious thinker, even though the old Tolstoy was a bad one. But there are 2 examples from the mid-19th century of how in the most far-seeing people of that period, the shift away from traditional religious thought about God towards life was beginning to take place. It was hugely accelerated in the early 20th century by writers like D.H. Lawrence, who familiarized us with the ideas of having faith in life, committing yourself to life, not sinning against life, never despairing of life, listening to the lessons that life's teaching you, and so on. A huge amount of new vocabulary entered the English language and is now used by everybody. A good example of how far our religious thought is already affected by this changeover is the way in which funeral services, both in this country and in my country, are now about the life of the dead person and not about the dead person's post-mortem existence facing divine judgment. Even the most conservative believers now take a life-centered view of death itself. That is why the funeral service in English-speaking countries is commonly described as a thanksgiving for the life of somebody, and the memorial service is commonly described now as a celebration of the life of so-and-so. Even death itself is now seen from the new life-centered point of view. What is more, the changeover to a life-centered vocabulary has affected even conservative religious believers, such as, for example, the Pope and Billy Graham, whose organisation won a famous prize for its use of the word life back in the 80s. So that all religious believers, both liberal and conservative, and the general public, have had part in this shift towards a new life-centered outlook. And in the New Religion of Life book, I try to demonstrate in detail how the attributes of God and the things that people used to say about God have, since World War II, been transferred to life. I noticed, for example, in film script, a film script of the 50s, and I forgot the name, the night my number came up, I think. We have a duty to life. That's early post-World War II. But many of the most familiar phrases are much more recent. For example, get a life, which I believe to be late 80s, and is quoted by Richard Rorty in 89. I think it's American. It spread immediately to other countries. When I was lecturing recently in Denmark, the audience told me that the phrase get a life was taken into Danish in its English form. It was not even translated. So desirable was this phrase. So exactly does it say what people now want to say that they adopted it in English. Get a life is a modern version of the traditional religious demand for a converted or examined life. Philosophy had always said you should live an examined life. Religion had always said you should live a new converted life. Today's modern expression is get a life. That's what religion is nowadays, to have a life to live. To know what it is to live a life to the full and make the most of your life while you have it. To treat each day of life as if it were your last. To live all the time at the end of the world with a sense of gratitude. To treat life as a gift. Well, it's that I began to investigate in the first life book, and then I turned to the word it and wrote an it book. In the life book, as it came out, there were 150 sayings. The it book had 450, and I had to go through all that stuff about facing up to it and not letting it get you down, and asking what it is in this sort of language. There, I was inspired by Geoffrey Parinder, the Africanist, 15 years ago, or 30 years ago. He wrote in one of his many books about African religious thought that where in English we say it is hot today, the African used to say God is hot today. Where we say it is raining, Africans used to say God is coming down as rain. I started asking myself, what is it? Why do we say it instead of God? I looked it up in the OED, and we've been saying it is cold since the end of the first millennium. It goes right back into Anglo-Saxon. It's a very ancient idiom. Perhaps it reflects the way in which, in the Christian tradition, the Western tradition, we've had a somewhat sharper contrast between God and the relatively independent natural order than they had in Africa. I don't know. That might be the reason. But anyway, I wrote a whole short book about the word it, and although the life book did sell, it sold out its first impression quickly and has not been reprinted, the it book failed completely. People just could not be persuaded to read it. But I felt I could show a good deal about the theology that's built into ordinary language, even in the case of the word it. And then I went on to other words like heaven and hell and so on in the third book of that little trilogy, Kingdom Come in Everyday Speech. Well, those three small books appeared in the years 1999 to 2000, and I dropped them. I gave up the project because I couldn't attract any interest in it. People couldn't accept the idea that ordinary language is the best radical theologian, and that it can lead the way in religious thought. It can teach us something. And only recently have I started a fresh little series of books, beginning with Life in 2003, taking up the theme again and trying to talk people into the idea that there really is something important religious thought here. It is possible to extract from ordinary language the consensus of our culture at our time, a real zeitgeist. It's given in ordinary language if we just develop sufficient awareness of how ordinary language is developing. We just get in the habit of listening out for new idioms as they enter the language. Now that vast computer databases of English are beginning to develop, it'll be quite easy to search the language on a very large scale and do the kind of project I have in mind in a thorough and scientific way. We'll discover what ideas about God are built into ordinary language. Let's take this, and I'm getting so interested, I'm talking longer than I should, no doubt. I've not yet even reached my main text. But let me give another illustration. In about 3 or 4 weeks' time, I want to visit a friend of mine who's now living in retirement on the south coast of England, I suspect terminally ill. As a young man, when we were students together, 45 years ago, he was very charming and gifted, and we thought he'd go far. And for a time it seemed he was going to go far. By his early 40s, he reached a very senior post of great responsibility and was becoming well known. Then, sadly, he crashed. Anxiety, depression got on top of him. He had to resign his job. He'd accepted over-promotion too early. Perhaps somebody had given him bad advice. And his career has struggled to recover. He's found it difficult to get back into a responsible full-time job since. So he's a gifted person who's had a hard life. Going to see him again, I wonder what my opening gambit will say, what I'll respond, what I'll say to him. As he's approaching the end of his life, and he must be looking back retrospectively on how things have gone for him, I wanted to ask him a question that will prompt him to say that kind of thing. And here are some of the things that you or I might venture in such a situation. Have you been up against it? How are things with you? How's it been? Do you feel you've been given a hard time? New Testament chaps used to call that the divine passive, didn't they? Like, blessed are those that mourn, they shall be comforted. Do you feel you've been given a hard time? The use of the passive construction in the Sermon on the Mount. How's life been treating you? Has it all sometimes seemed a bit too much? Is everything all right? In these rather ritual sayings, which we all use from time to time, we use a number of terms such as things, everything, it all, life, and other words such as God, fate, the nature of things, chance, luck, destiny, the way things go, and so on. It seems that by using these totalizing words, we sum up everything that we're up against in life, try to unify it, try to think about how it's treating us, well or badly, whether it is favourable to us or unfavourable, how we are to negotiate with it. That's to say, in these phrases, there's a germ of theology. That's why I started collecting such phrases, the phrases in which people talk about how life's been treating them lately, how everything has been going, how it is for them. Fascinating phrases, and I hope by now you're getting a slight shiver as you think of some of them for yourself. If you lie in bed thinking about more such phrases, you will, I think, tonight learn everything that I'm trying to say in this lecture. That there still is an incipient and rather spooky theology in ordinary language, but nobody has yet thought of trying to extract it, or even been interested in the project. It's in this context that we ought to be seeing the word God. In the philosophy of religion, all my life I looked at the Cappadocian Fathers and St. Augustine, and Plotinus and the Pseudo-Dionysius, as if it was chaps like that you looked at in order to learn something about God. And then you looked at the great philosophers. It had never occurred to me that there was another and perhaps much better method of proceeding by simply listening for the theological overtones in ordinary language that are there all the time. Nobody's thought yet of collecting them. Well, as I say, as I've been saying, I would argue that the new democratic religious consciousness in which the primary religious object is one's own life, about which one talks in the sort of ways I've been trying to suggest, this religion may be regarded as something like a fulfillment of the Protestant tradition, perhaps especially in America, where the common speech of ordinary people was from the beginning something of a religious touchstone. The people firmly rejected the idea of a special sacred language and a special caste of privileged persons to interpret it. The best of Calvinism was its secular, mundane belief in everydayness. So I'm hoping that what I'm trying to say, though I've had such a very difficult time making any headway with it at all this past 5 years, does have some resonances over here. As I say, I think you can demonstrate from the language that we now presently use that this new religion is already in place, and we profess it both with our lips and in our lives. I was astonished, having got some way with this new line of thought, to read some of my own early books again and discover that already 20-odd years ago, my own life idioms were much more vividly anthropomorphic and varied than my God idioms. So my own thinking, unconsciously, had already moved over to the religion of life, and I didn't know it. That's one in the eye for the old Protestant and Cartesian belief in faith's self-presence. We know what our own religion is, we know what we believe. Well, I discovered about 3-4 years ago that I had not known what my own religion was when I reread my own text in the light of the new convictions that I reached and discovered myself completely missing vivid idioms from my own early books. By the way, I looked at God idioms and found that in present-day English, there are only about 28 to 30 vivid God idioms still current and known to everybody. All the familiar things like playing God and so on that we still use, but only about 28 or 30, as compared with over 200 for the life idioms. So as language about God has contracted during the 20th century, so our language about life has expanded. And this is a fact, it's happened. It's happened to us, even if we don't know that it's happened. Hence the very, very curious fact that if I'm right, we don't actually know what our real religion is, because we're not aware, we never noticed the theological significance of our own language. Well, that was meant to be no more than my introduction, but I've used almost all my time, I think, talking, say, preliminary things, so I felt the need to do that. And perhaps you have now things you'd like to come back at. I'll leave with you the text of a written piece from a forthcoming thing that won't appear for a couple of years, yet a second edition of The New Religion of Life, which develops these ideas a bit further, tries to give them a philosophical context. But I do feel very strongly that I ought to be making more progress than I am with these ideas. And I think they're interesting and new. Wittgenstein, of course, familiarizes with the idea that there is a philosophy built into ordinary language, but he never thought to investigate the ways ordinary language is changing, so that he could show religious thought as a living activity, not something fossilized in the language, but something that's changing all the time, from year to year. And it has changed during our own time, and is changing now. It's along these lines that I believe we could make theology into a living subject, not a dead language. Well, I think I'd better shut up there, Mr. Chairman, and give the audience some time to come back at me.
There is indeed time for questions, and thank you. Keep the zone. Say it by the mic so the questions can be picked up.
I have two questions, actually. You speak of ordinary language as if this were an unproblematic category. Whose ordinary language? I think if you come from Cambridge to Yale, we probably share an ordinary language. If you took the train into New York and got up in Harlem, you'd probably hear quite a different language. Does it matter whose ordinary language? And the second question is really related to that I think our ordinary language may be a very good way of getting at what we actually believe. Now, is it possible, or is there any point even to trying to talking about what we should believe? Is that even a category in your view of things?
Thank you, yes. Whose ordinary language was the first question you raised. I had to define what I meant by a stock phrase that everybody knows who is an accomplished English speaker. One good way into it is this. If you pick up one of the standard English-German, German-English dictionaries, or English-French, French-English, you'll discover that language teachers have found that to teach English to German or French people, you have to teach a lot of stock phrases using words like life. The stock phrases that are incorporated at the end of the definitions of words give you a good idea of what phrases are reckoned to be so current that you're likely to hear them. So when I've been trying to work out criteria for accepting a phrase myself, I had to be convinced that I had heard it, that it's used in the media, and that any competent English speaker who speaks the language like a native will have heard this phrase and will recognize it. And when I've been around the world, I have found that in Australia and New Zealand and in America, people have already heard these phrases. Indeed, English, because of the huge amount of language we hear every day, English has become very highly intertextual. We talk in quotes. We hear huge amounts of what other people say every day. And that's the reason, one of the reasons why there are now so many stock phrases, like living life to the full, loving life, and so on. Also, you have to get to notice things. For example, I have noticed, and I think you'll say the same is true in this country, that if a young person dies in tragic circumstances, her friends will invariably say she loved life. Nowadays, they never say she loved God. In the media, you will hear the phrase, she loved life. She was bubbling, full of life, and so on. Well, that sort of convention you have to look out for. That also gives a clue to what the normative current usages are. And these usages, though they don't constrain us strictly, have a very great influence over us. I don't think even the most fanatical conservative could, in fact, today revive the sort of contempt for the body and for this life that was common in the 17th century. Big change has taken place and is demonstrable. That would be my answer to that question. I have tried to work out, and I have described the criteria for acceptance of phrases. And if you look at my list, I think you'll find you recognise every phrase. And I've got the right ones. But this means going through a pile of dictionaries of slang and proverbs and quotations and so on. As for the question of what religious language we should use, I'm suggesting that the language we actually do use and the religious and philosophical and other value cosmological assumptions that are built into that language should be our starting point, and it can replace the traditional natural theology. It's where we start from, and it constrains us a lot more than we think. I thought that as a pro, I was working out what I believe until I read some of my own texts and found their meaning has been changed by this work I've been doing on ordinary language. So I don't think we'll make much progress in religious thought until we're more aware of the kind of thing I've been trying to get across. Do you see what I mean? That you might want to go on to what we should believe, but it'll be difficult to be convincing unless you've done the other inquiry first. Perhaps we should hold all sorts of beliefs of an ascetical kind and so on that we no longer hold, but can't go all that much against the grain in these matters. I found that I keep coming back to ordinariness. I join Wittgenstein there and say, well, in the end, you circle round, you come back to ordinariness. And that's part of the message. But somebody else like to take that further?
Well, I had a thought in a little different direction. I was interested in your comment about the book, the German book that was similar to your own, that was written independently.
Yeah.
And you mentioned 20th century thinkers, and that made me think of Albert Schweitzer, who used historical criticism to figure out what the historical Jesus was all about, and found it completely alien to his own life and values. So he went off to Africa as a medical missionary, and the main theme of his work after that change was reverence for life. I don't know what the German
That's right.
is, perhaps.
Yes.
Colleagues.
Yes, I think this is
very similar to what you were talking about.
Yes, he was a Nietzschean. Unfortunately, his key text on Nietzsche is lost. The lecture he gave in Paris at the year and about just before leaving for Africa. But his phrase, reverence for life, has in mind particularly biological life, rather than our human historical life of symbolic exchange, which is always cultural. So my account's not quite the same as Schweitzer's, though I do agree that a lot in Schweitzer is still very interesting and very good. By the way, he said that of all his 4 careers, the one he hoped would in the long run be found something useful was philosophy. He believed that what he had to say in philosophy, sketchy though it is, was more important than what he had to say in medicine, music or theology. Curious.
In a lot of what you said, and your question, to me, it's the ethical part of religion. It is, which is how one lives one's life.
Yeah.
That's what ethics is. That's what Thoreau was into, and the elder Tolstoy, and certainly Schweitzer made a point of living a good life, whatever that is. And that seems to me that a lot of theology, ethics is left. Theology became metaphysics, right? And the ethics left, but the people lived, tried to live the life that they think God wants them to live, which is ethics.
There's a lot in that, yes. I remember when I first studied theology, the best-known figure at Cambridge, Charlie Moe, used to give a great staple course of lectures called The Theology and Ethics of the New Testament. But the ethics was always an appendix. The real meat was the theology. And that's the way it's been for many centuries. Yes, in my own non-realist interpretation of Christian doctrine, I tried to get out the metaphysics by translating all the doctrines into their ethical demand, so that to believe in the doctrine of creation was day by day to receive your own life as a pure gift. To believe in the resurrection was day by day to try to live a new life, having left the old behind. And I've always argued, I still argue actually, that this ethical method of interpreting Christian doctrine is the only convincing response we can put up to those evangelicals who are keen to make the resurrection, for example, into the resuscitation of the corpse of Jesus. It's not. If you look at St. Paul, it's a matter of living a new life in the Spirit of Christ. And so on. So, yes, I would argue for an ethical and existential reinterpretation of the whole of Christian doctrine. Yeah, we should be living the future life now.
I should point out to you that I tried to listen to your questions to your friend, and they were all about what was being done to him. The question is, what is he doing? What is his life?
Yes.
What God or life is doing to him.
Yes, that's right. I was interested in the language he was using and comparing it with other cases where we use periphrases or euphemisms because we don't want to be too explicitly theological. For example, instead of saying, I will pray for you, we say, I'll be bearing you in mind, I'll be with you in spirit, you'll be in my thoughts. People use periphrases. And these sayings that I was thinking of using to my friend were a bit like that. What I was suggesting is that here you have a context for understanding what part the idea of God might still possibly play, or at what point something like theology still enters human speech every day. But I agree that I was imagining my friend near the end of his life, wondering whether he could say amen to his own life, whether he could feel content or satisfied with the way things had gone despite his ups and downs.
I mean, the Ten Commandments was...
Yes, yes.
Was what we should do.
You mean he should be self-examination and that sort of thing, yes? I don't myself find people so preoccupied with that now, at any rate in my country. I don't know. Rather, in a post-metaphysical age in which we're dominated by thoughts of transience and contingency, the struggle is to make some kind of overall sense of one's own life. At least that's how it seems to be for most people. Can one say amen to one's own life? Can one feel a sense of life satisfaction at the end of one's life? Do you see what I mean? That the ordinary person's struggle for meaning is now more obvious than their struggle for forgiveness. But other people, gentlemen at the very back, please. There you go.
I'd be grateful for just a little more clarification about your characterization of the present state of theology.
Yeah.
Because at one point you seem to say that it not only doesn't make progress, but it cuts a very poor figure in certain ways, but you seem to apply that especially to the, shall we say, the left side, the left wing of theology. And that surprised me a little when you said that in certain kinds of exchanges, evangelicals actually do better in debates than the left does. So the thing is more dire for the left in some ways, and yet it seems as if I understood the rest of your position at all correctly, this approach, the only possible way forward is really via a non-evangelical approach. The evangelicals are worse off. They may win debates,
yes,
but they're worse off. In what way are they worse off? Are they? I'm losing the threads there.
Yeah. Yes, I would say in the long run, of course, the evangelicals are doomed. Of course they are. They're wrong. They just plain wrong. And they've done terrible damage because of their eager struggles for power and the way they have more or less single-handedly discredited Christian ethics. That really is hateful and makes me very angry. And in my own country, great harm is being done now by the inability of the liberals to put up any serious opposition to the evangelicals. The fear, I think, ever since 1963, when Michael Ramsey condemned John Robinson, the fear is that if ever it came to a court case, the courts would find in favour of evangelical literalism against liberal allegorism or symbolism. That's the feeling. The lawyers are literal-minded. The evangelicals would claim to be keeping exactly to Anglican formularies or the formularies of other churches too, and they'd win the case, they'd get the property and the jobs and everything else. And since then, the authorities in my own church have always allowed the evangelicals the high ground and have tried to avoid unduly provoking them. But I personally think this is proving a very bad strategy. The liberals have unfortunately failed to persuade the general public that liberal theology makes more sense and is more humane and rational than evangelical theology. Great shame. But why we failed so badly, I don't know.
You really don't know about that, I see.
It's a puzzle. In the case of John Robinson, there was a short while during which one felt there might be something like mass enthusiasm for his ideas. At any rate, a lot of people were very enthusiastic indeed for a little while. Then it faded. And as everyone knows, at the end of the 60s, the optimistic post-Vatican II spirit melted away and religious thought began to go neoconservative. But why? Why did that happen? It's a puzzle. But to this day, Rowan Williams is in the position of accepting that the evangelicals hold the high ground, therefore he must not say anything that really offends them, therefore he must appear to hold views about, for example, whether gay people may be ordained priest or bishop. He doesn't in fact hold. He's in a dishonest position. Of course he cannot lead any kind of liberal fight back because of the position, the political position in which the bishops have been trapped for 30 years, 40 years. Great mistake. It's also, of course, the Roman Catholic Church. Very difficult indeed for Rome to relax the doctrinal controls, but it needs to be done. Sorry, are you still dissatisfied? I think political mistakes have been made by church leaders.
That clarifies it a lot. Just one caution, speaking only for myself, about predictions of this kind.
Yeah.
I was sobered in reading that Thomas Jefferson predicted with great confidence that within, I think, a generation after his death, 80% of the population would be Unitarian.
Yes, it's not happened. Yes,
He's
yes.
wrong.
Yes, the same things happened to the liberal tradition in Judaism, which was on the verge of amalgamating with Christianity in the early 19th century. Moses Mendelssohn and all that in Germany. Or the liberal Hinduism that was blending into Western idealist philosophy in, for example, in this country, the Radha-Krishnamurti and so on, 80 years ago. It's surprising. Liberal movements, universalizing movements in other religions have similarly come to grief in the 20th century, which is very sad. Yeah. Hinduism, too, has gone neoconservative, aggressively, messianically nationalistic in the last few decades. What Gandhi would have thought of that, I hate to think. Somebody else would like to raise something? Yes.
I have a question about how two different parts of the project are hanging together.
Yeah.
On the one hand, you've mentioned that the redeemable part of Christian doctrine is the ethical implications, if I understood you properly. Then what you like to retrieve when you think about Christian doctrine are the ethical implications of those views. But then I wonder on the other side whether trying to locate the substance of religious conviction in ordinary language is such that you don't have much of a normative ability to, say, stand over against contemporary practice, that extraction from ordinary language isn't really very much of a normative procedure. It'd be more of a descriptive one. Or at the very least, whatever norms you would be getting are the norms that are embedded in the zeitgeist of the ordinary language. And what prompts the question for me is, in some ways, this project seems congenial to, say, John Dewey's A Common Faith.
That's right.
But there, Dewey, he doesn't want to simply, as I read it anyhow, he doesn't want to simply confine himself to, say, ordinary language. He has an anthropology, he has a view of history that he embeds into his account such that he can provide a teleology of this is the way things are going, and from that then make normative claims. This is the way things ought to happen. And I wonder whether your project has that kind of resource.
Yes, I take the post-structuralist view that the human individual is only a local privatization of the flow of language. So the public flow of language in the public realm is for me prior to individual selfhood. That's why for me it's so important. Secondly, when the controversy about my non-realist interpretation of Christian doctrine developed in the 80s, I was at that time still so cheerfully saying the creed, just interpreting it non-realistically. And the bishops were kicking some of my people out of their jobs because they were failing to hold the right philosophical interpretation of what they were doing when they said the creed. my best objection to that was to reply by saying, I do keep the religion a lot better than my critics. I just reject their metaphysics. Now, why is it, how do the bishops know that the most important single principle of Christian theology is a philosophical claim about how you've got to understand it? You see, I was trying to break people's assumption that you've got to understand religious dogma realistically. You don't have to. Let me give an example of this, the kind of argument I used to put forward in the 80s. 1 John chapter 4 contains a famous passage equating God with the virtue of love. It's said that if you love your neighbour and you're in the agapeistic sort of love, you're in God. By talking about God, we just mean to talk poetically about this kind of love. The passage can be read purely ethically and non-metaphysically. And I think a non-metaphysical reading of 1 John 4 must be justified. Furthermore, that reading is extremely strong in Christian hymnody and poetry. For example, George Herbert's Love Bade Me Welcome is typical of the Christian poetry in which love spelt with a capital L, just the virtue, is used as equivalent to God. And the 19th century is full of hymns of that sort by Whittier and all sorts of people. Just check through your own hymn book. You'll find loads and loads of hymns addressed simply to love with a capital L. So the non-realist view of God is part of the Christian tradition. But if I try to say so and claim legitimacy for the non-realist view of God, people say you've no right to call yourself a Christian at all. They somehow just know that the kind of Platonic realism is an absolute for Christian theology. Well, this is simply, to my mind, a bad religious mistake. A lot of the New Testament is not nearly so metaphysical as we always read it to be. You see, so I was fighting a philosophy of religion battle against people's assumption of a crude realism as a sine qua non of Christian thought. Something, by the way, that Rowan Williams still holds on to, even though he knows better.
I suppose what I'm wondering is whether it is a religious mistake to interpret these claims metaphysically. If what you're trying to do with religion is something ethical, you would still hold it to be mistaken.
That's what I said in Taking Leave of God, that in our time, as the old cosmological, organised kind of religion is turning into spirituality, being replaced by spirituality, so we've got to translate Christian doctrine into spirituality and read the things that are being said about God as determinations of the religious life of the believer, not as metaphysics. Roughly, what's happened since the Protestant Reformation is a gradual replacement of the old grand sacred cosmology with religion as a kind of programming within the individual subject that shapes his life. So I can't understand why people through the 80s and 90s used to denounce me uphill and down dale for holding that view. Because, as I said, I was keeping the religion intact in a post-metaphysical age. Why do they object so much? Why do they insist that a sine qua non is that one should hold on to an indefensible philosophical position? But I couldn't make any headway with it. I still can't. It's strange, but it looks as if for something like thought control and disciplinary reasons, the Conservatives feel they've got to hold on to and fetishise a realistic reading of Christian doctrine, perhaps especially of things like resurrection. But it's curious how little progress is made with that controversy.
I'd like to get one question. You talked about solar ethics.
Yes.
The books and all, a very fascinating concept, imaginative, creative. What really does that mean in content?
Yes. Solar ethics means an expressionist approach to ethics. Instead of an ethic of separation from the world, dividing yourself into two bits, a bit that you're leaving behind and the bit that you're purifying and getting back to the next world, you treat yourself as something simply to be expended, burnt out. The sun lives by the same process by which it's dying. That's how we should live. That was the initial idea of solar ethics as a way of interpreting the teaching of Jesus that was completely without legalism. And a way of conveying the particular kind of immediacy and 100% commitment to life that I wanted to bring back into religious ethics. I was reacting violently against Kierkegaard, for whom your religious selfhood was a secret identity that's completely invisible to the rest of the world. Having in my youth been an ardent Kierkegaardian, by the 80s I was beginning to rebel violently against him and to want to go to the opposite extreme. As for the business of solarity, till death I in this mercy seal and make the sacrifice complete. Do you remember that rather grand Wesley hymn? That catches very well the spirit of solar ethics. But I often find radical theology better expressed in hymns than in books. I'm curious, often in Methodist ones. Odd. Thank you.
Perhaps this would be a good point to call our formal discussion to a halt and offer our thanks for a very stimulating lecture.